Hello everyone, my name is Jack and in this video I'm going to read my submission to the 2025 Berggruen Prize essay competition, which I didn't win, but maybe I'll win something else with this video. Before I read my submission, I would like to give you an introduction to the Berggruen Prize essay competition as well as my essay. Of course, you can skip that if you like. What is the Berggruen Prize essay competition? The Berggruen Prize essay competition is an annual contest organized by the Berggruen Institute, a think tank founded in 2010 by investor philanthropist Nicholas Berggruen and journalist Nathan Gordels to research and publish on topics related to governance, economics, geopolitics, and technology, as written on Wikipedia. I'll now read the original description of the 2025 edition. Essay, Philosophy and Culture. The 2025 Berggruen Prize Essay Contest. This year's theme is Consciousness, written by Nathan Gordels, published on June 6, 2025. The nature of consciousness has enthralled philosophers for millennia. More recently, modern scientific approaches that seek to illuminate how physical processes in the brain give rise to subjective, conscious experience engender as many questions as they do answers. The 2025 Berggruen Prize Essay Contest seeks original essays that offer a fresh perspective on what Australian philosopher David Chalmers has famously and elusively labelled the hard problem of consciousness. As is the case in all the Institute's intellectual endeavors, essays are welcome from across all traditions and disciplines. Original claims must be defended by a strong argument and demonstrate thorough knowledge of established theories of consciousness from which they may depart or further develop. Essays might reflect on, but are by no means limited to, the following themes. The origin of consciousness. Materiality of consciousness, emergence of consciousness, non-human consciousness, including machines, manifestation of consciousness, threshold of consciousness, consciousness in relation to life, experience of consciousness, evolution of consciousness, consciousness across cosmologies. Essays may be submitted in either Chinese or English, with the winner in each language category receiving a $50,000 prize. While the intent is to recognize one winner per language, the competition may honor multiple exceptional essays in any given year. The original deadline for submission was July 31, but it was extended to September 15 to, quote, accommodate global academic calendars. Introduction to my essay submission. I submitted my essay with the following abstract, which was necessary for participation. From the birth of the ego to the emergence of individuality, consciousness, our state of awareness, has developed over the centuries for us humans and did not begin far back in animal evolution. While mental imagery has been regarded as divine authority in ancient cultures, we can today perceive it as imaginary, a process that involves focusing our attention on our inner mental life. Through a cultural development of double consciousness, we are able to hold two different beliefs. Following a narrative while dismissing it is unreal. Furthermore, we are able to reflect on our perception of reality by telling stories through technological advancements leading to mediums such as cinema and video games. What we can learn from these insights is that we should foster the ability and the will to introspect through fiction in order to understand the problem of consciousness. Through this cultural development of the West, we are gaining more agency and freedom through autonomy and individualism. Note that the maximum number of characters in this field was 500, so I had to admit the last 4 words. And now I'll start reading my essay in its complete, raw form. From divine authority to individual autonomy, how the development of consciousness gave us more agency and freedom. Art is the daughter of freedom. Friedrich Schiller. The question of consciousness has puzzled philosophers and scientists for centuries. Generally speaking, it describes the quality of awareness, whether it is about an external object or an inner experience. Ultimately, the nature of consciousness is entirely subjective, as it is derived from our individual lived experiences. They shape our perceptions of reality and have a significant impact on how we interact with the world and interpret facts. Consequently, the definition of consciousness is thus deeply tied to how we human beings perceive things and what we are aware of. Therefore, making any general assumptions is not easy. There are indeed many theories of consciousness by different philosophers, but ultimately, it is the questions we ask that provide us with insight into the nature of consciousness. Changes in mentality throughout history. I think we can find a precise answer to the long-debated question of consciousness by looking at it from a certain perspective with asking where it is going and how we gain more agency and thus freedom through mental developments throughout the history of mankind. By examining the evolution of human thought and agency over time, we do indeed find that our mentality must have undergone significant transformations. Thousands of years ago, for example, we humans believed in the existence of gods and a mystical world affecting nature, as well as our minds and bodies, as the French scholar Lucien Lévy-Bruhl wrote in 1926. The practice of mummification to preserve the dead for irrational means is clear evidence of superstitious beliefs in early civilizations, as mummies have been found by archaeologists on every continent. While ancient Egyptians were removing internal organs and treating the body with carbonate minerals, before wrapping it with linen around 3000 BC, the people from the Andean pre-ceramic Chinchorro culture of South America were replacing the decaying body parts with natural materials like sticks and white ashes around 2000 years earlier. In both ancient cultures, the living and the dead formed an inseparable whole. Since no written records have survived because writing had not been developed in 5050 BC, we can only speculate that the Chinchorro people saw their dead in close contact with spiritual powers who were responsible for natural disasters like earthquakes and floods from which they were suffering. An explanation for honoring the dead would be that they were securing their goodwill, believing that this would counteract natural disasters. The much later Egyptians excelled with their arts of mummification to preserve the human body in order to establish a, quote, connection and cooperation between the surviving components of a person such as body, heart, and soul, treating it as a statue to be worshipped with a personal burial chamber, as the German Egyptologist and religious scholar Jan Assmann writes. What we call superstition today was therefore an integral part of ancient civilizations, whether it was the belief in amulets for protection or rites and costumes performed to ensure a good harvest or to cast off evil. As the Dutch archaeologist and Egyptologist Henry Frankfurt and his colleagues noticed in 1977, the spiritual and everyday spheres were inseparable and events were always dictated by invisible beings. Another indicator of such beliefs was that dreams in ancient civilizations were interpreted as divine commandments or messages. As Julian Jaynes points out, the ancient Greek have used the word onero for a dream in the Iliad, but it actually means God. In the second book of the Iliad, the god Zeus sent such an onero in the form of the god Nestor to Agamemnon while he's asleep in his tent. This dream has ultimately initiated the Trojan War. This written record provides striking evidence that the intermental world was associated with the divine, spiritual world as far as back as the 8th century BC. Thus, dreams were not necessarily perceived in a distanced manner and therefore not considered to be fiction. How has our thinking from divine authority to the concept of fiction changed? Did this change occur because consciousness, and therefore our awareness of our inner mental world, evolved? Furthermore, what are some signs today that can show us that consciousness is constantly evolving? What are some recent and widely used inventions of the 20th and 21st centuries that can give us insight into our conscious interiority, and can even have the potential to change how we perceive ourselves and reality, leading to a change in how we interact with the world and each other? Creating new realities and thus perspectives through technology. For me, the most important invention of the 20th century for our consciousness was cinema, followed by television, mainly because it introduced millions of people in the years that followed to the concept that reality can be taken apart and replicated. Television series like Flash Gordon in 1954, which are entirely fictional, made people aware that an entire fictional universe can be created by using different props, technological developments, and perspectives through camera techniques. People inspired by Flash Gordon further developed these techniques to bring their own series to life. For example, filmmaker George Lucas, who has had a significant influence on the history of cinema and its technology, because he wanted to immerse the audience in a story that seems believable. It has been his idea to make, quote, a kind of cinema variété film of the future, something that would look like a documentary crew had made a film about some character in a time yet to come. Since his first film, GHX 1138 in 1970. For his groundbreaking Star Wars saga that followed at the end of the decade, he chose two cameramen known for their work in documentary movies instead of hiring directors of photography with experience in making feature films. As a director, Lucas decided to go for close-ups and let the actors walk into the picture. According to production designer John Barry, this made the movie look like it was shot on location, rather than on a constructed movie set. Lucas explained his approach to Star Wars. The film has to make us believe it really existed, that we've really gone to another galaxy to shoot the film. The success of the imaginary is to make something totally fabricated seem real, and that everything stays inside the invented system, that everything be credible and totally fantastic at the same time. Thus, Lucas used stylistic means to create another reality. In the years before movies came to cinemas, Karl Marx observed that the human eye perceives differently than the, quote, crude, non-human eye, during the time of the early photography. Stepping into another world was thus first made possible visually through a change in perspective, using technology to depict reality in another way. Long before cinema introduced the concept of another reality to millions of viewers, the theater in ancient Greece offered multiple realities outside the social world, as Peter Berggruen and Thomas Luckmann write. They continue to say that the transition between realities is marked by the rising and falling of the curtain. As the curtain rises, the spectator is transported to another world, with its own meanings in an order that may or may not have much to do with the order of everyday life. As the curtain falls, the spectator returns to reality, that is, to the paramount reality of everyday life by comparison with which the reality presented on the stage now appears tenuous and ephemeral. However, the German philologist Bruno Snell points out that what we today, quote, ascribe to the imagination or an act of sympathetic identification was considered to be an actual experience during Homer's times. It was not until the 12th century that thinkers began to address the, quote, apparent disjunction between thought and reality in a more profound manner. According to Charles M. Rutting, this marked a significant shift not only in doctrinal beliefs, but also mentality itself during that time. This change in perspective laid the groundwork for the development of our modern notion that, quote, an ontological dichotomy exists between knower and what is known. Mental imagery became regarded as imaginary or fictitious. This altered the way we perceive and understand mental images, marking the beginning of a development in which they were no longer regarded as divine only. In the 15th century, the printing press made storytelling accessible to the masses. The literary press began to allow, quote, readers to virtually visit and imagine new places and no doubt expand the individual's abstracting, hypothetical, and speculative abilities, at least among the reading population, as Brian J. McVeigh puts it. Therefore, people began to realize that they can hold two opposing beliefs with following a narrative while dismissing it as unreal. In Don Quixote, which is said to be one of the first novels published in 1605, Arthur Miguel de Cervantes was well aware of the alliance between fiction and reality. When the main character attends a puppet show that aims to reenact the fictional rescue of Melisandre from the Moors, he becomes so immersed into the narrative that he pulls out his sword and attacks the puppets, switching between frames in a post-modern world. Michael Saylor observes a cultural development through this process. For him, To be modern is, in part, to exercise a double consciousness and to embrace complementarities, to be capable of living simultaneously in multiple worlds without experiencing cognitive dissonance. According to the German philosopher Jürgen Habermas, self-reflexivity is a feature of modernity. It is tied to a philosophy of reflection that issues from the basic fact of self-consciousness, and with self-reflexivity we are able to gain insight into the processes of our consciousness. Speaking of self-reflexivity, it is clear to us humans today that we are playing games of make-believe when we watch movies or play video games. Terms like movie and video game denote metalinguistic and/or metacommunicative rules, as Gregory Bateson writes. Thus, we switch between two different frames here, the reality and the play frame. The play frame is mental and comprises the relationship between humans and the world around them, while the reality frame is governed by physical and biological processes. With this in mind, we can go back several thousand years, say for example to ancient Egypt, to ask an intriguing question. Did the people who lived at the time really see their creations, the gods Anubis, Amun, Osiris, etc., as a form of play? The answer to this question is probably no. To be able to answer this question with certainty, we need to examine whether the word play or similar terms existed at the time or not, how they were used, and what exactly was meant by them. With these questions in mind, we can recognize how important linguistic nuances are in historical texts for accurately interpreting the intentions and perceptions of ancient cultures, providing a clearer picture of their mentality. Someone who has an answer to our questions is Brian J. McVeigh. He states that art, in modern sense, which demands hypothetical as-ifness, did not exist. Creating new realities. How movies are made. Let us conduct a thought experiment now. If we were to travel back in time and take the 2001 movie Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone to play it to an audience in ancient Rome in 400 BC, for example, ignoring the language problem, then what would they think about it? As David Heyman, the producer of the film, explains, it includes between 700 and 800 visual effects shots that bring magical creatures and spells to life. The movie begins with a remarkable scene for us. On a dark and quiet street at night, called Privet Drive, the wizard Albus Dumbledore, played by actor Richard Harris, uses a device called a deluminator, which looks like a cigarette lighter, to zap the light out of the lampposts. This sequence of moving pictures raises an interesting question. Would people in ancient times perceive electricity as a type of magic? Given that they would likely be unfamiliar with the natural laws of physics behind electricity, it is reasonable to conclude that they would indeed view it as magic. Electricity emerged from the technological developments of the Industrial Revolution around 1,800 years later. The following 2 centuries saw a development of tools that could be used to alter reality with optical effects for entertainment. Without these inventions, especially computers, companies like Industrial Light and Magic, founded by filmmaker George Lucas in 1975, wouldn't be able to create believable visual effects for movies like Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone. Therefore, one has to be aware of the possibilities of these tools to dismiss visual effects in movies as unreal, while still integrating them as part of the narrative. To give an example, shortly after Dumbledore darkens the street with his deluminator, Minerva McGonagall, played by Maggie Smith, transforms from a cat into her true self, while the audience sees only the shadow of the transformation. Besides knowing that everything that happens in movies is unreal, one has to have a sense of the laws of nature, how gravity and electricity work, and thus be aware of the fact that certain things can't be possible at all, and therefore dismiss the mystical world of our ancient times with gods and magic as unreal too. In this mythical world, natural phenomena such as thunder and drought were explained through the power of the imagination, rather than scientific research. Speaking of creativity, the original author of Harry Potter, John K. Rowling, had a vivid imagination, and it was important for director Chris Columbus to be faithful to the book. Rowling created an entire world and was willing to devote her time to consulting scriptwriter Steve Kloves with her meticulously written down knowledge of Hogwarts and the characters in her notebooks, whose task was to condense her book with over 200 pages into a movie script containing the scenes that represent the book. But how was the imaginary world brought to life for the big screen? As Columbus explains, the team had no filmic reference to bring Rowling's world to life for the film's audience. One example is the game of Quidditch, which lived in the minds of readers before the movie came to cinemas, and is played with broomsticks and different types of balls in a stadium with 3 large golden hoops. For the design of the Hogwarts castle, production designer Stuart Craig drew on the cathedrals and thus elements found in our real world, as Hogwarts is supposed to be over 1,000 years old. In addition to the real sets for shooting scenes with actors, a polystyrene model was also created for the film. Another example was the large dining hall in the movie, which was inspired by the design of a real place, Christ Church College in Oxford. What made the team feel successful in their efforts were the many children who played Hogwarts students in the large movie sets, saying that it was, quote, exactly like they imagined it would be, quote end. Authenticity, and therefore realism, was an important goal for the team in bringing Rowling's imaginary world to life. In addition to the set design, the visual effects naturally evolved out of the book and thus the author's world, as Heyman explains. They include the 3-headed dog Fluffy, a ghost, a troll, and Hagrid's baby dragon Norbert. Visual effects supervisors have the task of bringing imaginary worlds to life and making the impossible visually possible for an audience sitting in front of a screen. Storyboards provide directors with a preview of the planned sequence, giving them a feel for the camera techniques and the progression of the story. They also tell the visual effects supervisor what can and should be built for the film as a practical model for authentic and detailed shots with realistic lighting and explosions, for example, and what will be computer generated. Another filmmaking practice is to use green or blue screens, which allow actors and objects to be easily separated from the background to replace them with a computer-generated world or a matte painting of a landscape or room, creating the illusion of an environment that is imaginary and thus not really there. Thus, visual effects supervisors blend elements of our real world with the imaginary. What would an audience in ancient Rome think of these imaginary places and visual effects, not knowing that they were created by a group of people to bring an alternative reality to life? Would they begin to believe in irrational practices and thus in magic as portrayed in the movie? The answer would probably be yes, because they would not be aware that movies were produced by a team of people to tell stories. Therefore, they wouldn't switch to a play frame when told that they are watching a movie. The development of consciousness in children and early humans. How did our ability to switch between the play and the reality frame, as well as our understanding of fictional or virtual worlds, evolve? As we have seen above, it was certainly a cultural development, and it happened through the development of language, which we can also observe in children. As development psychologists say, children learn theory of mind by interacting with the others and the world. Peter Hobson writes that the child acquires the ability to use symbols to transcend their own perspective through others. This often manifests in children experimenting with toys or objects, alienating their actual purpose in order to better understand the world and its complexities. Therefore, children not only learn to grasp objects physically, but also mentally. Through its own activity, the child gets to know the world outside by forming concepts and learning from others through language, for example about the me and you. But how and when did this development of consciousness begin? As Erich Fromm makes aware, we find an uninterrupted chain of reactions in animals which starts with a certain stimulus, for example hunger, and leads to a more or less defined sequence of action that relieves the tension caused by that stimulus. Instead of a predetermined instinctive behavior, man must weigh up the various possible behaviors in his mind for the best chances of survival after he has become aware of them. Another prerequisite for consciousness would be the use of hands. As D.W. Winnicott argues, children use transitional objects for an area to which an inner reality and external life both contribute when the mother is absent. These transitional objects are neither part of the body of a child, nor separate from or identical to the self and not part of external reality, for example, a toy or a blanket. Through this process, children use an object as a replacement for something else, thereby learning symbolism. Just as children use their hands and mouths to explore their environment and search for these transitional objects, early humans used their hands to gather food and later materials. While both hands were most likely first used to crush animal bones in order to obtain the valuable marrow inside as food during difficult times of drought, the use of hands developed into the construction of spears for hunting with objects such as flintstones and sticks around 500,000 years ago. Around 300,000 years later, Homo sapiens has developed a number of circa 40 tools with which early humans were able to craft further tools such as bone needles and fishing hooks. This period is known as the Middle Stone Age and began around 300,000 years ago with a significant leap in the development of stone tools. As Andy Clark and David Chalmers have argued, the mind, and thus our consciousness, is shaped by interactions with tools, as well as the social environment. With the ability to experiment with these found objects, the first humans were able to be creative with them. They not only developed tools, but also discovered different colored materials that would leave traces behind on stones, so they used them for painting. One of the earliest drawings are estimated to be 40,000 years old and were found in Western Australia's Pilbara region and the Uluru district of South Australia. Cave paintings, found in the Lascaux Cave in France, are circa 17,000 years old, depicting not only animals but also abstract signs made with iron oxide, charcoal and ochre. Consequently, early humans were able to depict symbols by acquiring the ability to memorize objects as well as animals and to trace them as eidetic images with colored materials on walls. With breaking down the world continuum into objects as a first step toward consciousness, early humans made them assimilable for the ego, as the German psychologist Erich Neumann writes. He continues to say that the assimilative powers of the consciousness, which enables it to grasp objects first as images and symbols, then as contents, and finally as concepts, and to absorb and arrange them in a new order, presuppose this analytical function. Once children have gained this ability to use symbols, they are able to ascribe a mind to an imaginary companion. This ability was clearly present in times when people believed in the existence of gods. However, it seems that the people of those times were unable to understand their fictional creations as fantasy, using them as an explanation for natural forces. Neumann sees this as infantile, wishful thinking, equal to Sigmund Freud's expression of sovereign power of thought, which describes the alleged peculiarity of childish and primitive natures to believe that thoughts are effective, in example, real. As Jean Piaget has found out, children incline to, quote, assume that theirs is the only way of seeing the world, quote, and to use Charles M. Redding's words. Thus, Piaget argued that the worldview of children in this age is egocentric, as they are, quote, not fully aware of their uniqueness as individuals, or not able to, quote, differentiate clearly between themselves and the other world, quote, end. Therefore, they tend to, quote, endow the world with qualities similar to those they possess themselves. Piaget writes, when children between 5 and 8 are asked whether the sun could go away if it wanted to, they always answer that it could. If it does not go away, it is because it has to shine a little longer or because it has to lighten us during the day. Clouds cannot go because they show us the way, etc. In short, if there are natural laws at work, it is not because the bodies in question are physically determined. They could perfectly well evade the law if they wish to. It is simply that they are obedient. Related to that, Charles Redding makes the striking observation that the, quote, concepts that objects act as they do because they are obedient is particularly interesting in view of the belief, common before the revival of science in the 12th century, that order of nature is due to the world's submission to God's will. Until the 12th century, Ordeals were widely used for centuries without any provoking complaints. As we have seen earlier, dreams were interpreted as divine messages in the Iliad, thus they were perceived as external to the body. When children are asked about their dreams, then we can observe some interesting answers that often suggest that these dreams are not seen as a fantasy. According to Piaget, children consider dreams to be objective phenomena which originated from outside the dreamer, remained outside the dreamer, and could be shared with others in the room, to use Marjorie Taylor's words. These dreams could be fearful, and just like children were afraid at night that there is a monster under the bed or in the closet, people in ancient times may have been afraid of their gods, which they perceived as real, which would give a reason to perform rituals to appease the gods. It is not until about the age of 7 that children pass false belief tests. This allows them to discredit fictional creations as unreal, to become aware of fiction as well as taking into account what other people know when they are talking to them. This makes them start to doubt the existence of mythical figures such as Santa Claus or the Tooth Fairy. Erich Neumann writes that child psychology is more transpersonal than personal, just like that of early humans, because he sees no developed ego complex capable of gaining experience, or at least remembering experience, here. He sees a conflict between the world of the instinct and developing ego consciousness in psychological development. Making use of symbols is the first step towards separating natural impulse and creative fertilization, which takes its form in myth that uses metaphors. Here, the inward-flowing libido whirls forth as creative art. What is real? What is not? Today, almost everyone has access to stories through the internet. Artificial intelligence, also abbreviated as AI, can even create stories that we don't initially recognize as fiction. With deep learning and text-to-image models altering content such as images, video, or audio to create deepfakes, it can sometimes be hard to determine what is real and what is not. Our cultural development can therefore remind us that we can switch into a playframe and dismiss these deepfakes as unreal. Moreover, the hybridization of our world makes virtual and augmented reality a part of our daily lives. Not only are virtual elements such as displays with icons playing a role, but also virtual characters. In 2016, for example, the company Gatebox introduced a virtual home robot that uses a hologram of a virtual character named Hikari Atsuma. In a promotional video, she communicates with her owner and assists him throughout the day, providing information about the weather, for example. Again, we can use the insight of our cultural development to conclude that we are playing games of make-believe with these virtual characters. This is where artificial intelligence differs from fictional characters. We know that fictional characters aren't real, but artificial intelligence can give us the illusion that a fictional character is real by suspending disbelief in the actions of fictional characters. While the fictional character is based on fictional propositions and associated metaphors, artificial intelligence doesn't operate on that basis. AI provides us with a language model to solve problems and is therefore incapable of generating new meanings and thus metaphors itself. Only we humans can do that. A brief history of metaphors and perspectives of the self. Metaphors are easily found in our language. One example is the expression "to have a heart," which means to be able to show compassion. Were these words, which have mental meanings, already present in ancient cultures? Julian Jaynes, who has touched on many disciplines such as neuroscience, linguistics, psychology, archaeology, history, and religion for a theory of consciousness, has examined ancient texts such as the Iliad and found evidence of first words with mental meanings such as thumos for internally experienced activity, phrens associated with speech, and kredi referring to the heart. He observed that the frequency and meaning of these words gradually changed from about 850 to 600 BC. According to him, there are 4 phases going from the non-conscious to the conscious: objective, internal, subjective, and synthetic. In the first phase, these terms referred only to simple external observations. The second phase marks the point where these terms have come to mean things inside the body, particularly certain sensations. Brian J. McVeigh explains that ancient people believed that physiological experiences felt in the chest or heart were what we would now label psychological events, because in times past people believed that the heart and other organs was the seat of psychological occurrences. Bruno Snell observes that Homeric man splits what we interpret as the soul into three components, defined by the analogy of physical organs. Psyche, nous, and thymus were therefore the, quote, organs of life for the ancient Greek during the times of Homer. Therefore, ancient people took figures of speech in a literal sense. In the third phase, these terms refer to processes that we call mental, and in the final phase, the various hypostases unite into one conscious self capable of introspection, thus being part of the conscious experience. By being aware of what is happening inside of us, we are able to examine thoughts, feelings, values, and experiences from the perspective of what they mean to the self. This leads to a greater self-awareness, and thus increases our agency. Through language, we can assign these mental meanings to our lived experiences. We can therefore not only express our inner mental life more clearly, but also observe ourselves and adopt different perspectives. According to Julian Jaynes, we can observe what we are currently doing with the concept of the metaphor me, while the analog I allows us to express what we would like to do or imagine. Jaynes argues that these perspectives of the self didn't exist in our early history of mankind. They were developed alongside social forms of living together. A view from the outside makes a certain idea, and thus an identity, possible. Moreover, people had no self-concept in ancient civilizations, which evolves when people perceive themselves as individuals. Just like archaic dreams, such as those in the Iliad, emotions were not perceived as generated inside the person, but were believed to be brought by the gods to have an effect on the organs. Thus, archaic people couldn't integrate their perceived feelings into the self, as there was no concept for it. As Bruno Snell observes, love is not an emotion which breaks forth from within, but the intervention of a deity, for the ancient Greek. Jaynes finds the beginning of conscious interiority with the Greek word nous, referring to a, quote, subjective conscious mind, used by Solon of Athens, an important Greek reformer who lived from circa 630 to 560 BC, known for laying the foundations of Athenian democracy. One of the doctrines attributed to him, as well as other Greek thinkers such as Socrates, is know thyself. The emergence of these perspectives could be the first step toward individualism. However, it was not until the 17th century that the word individual came to mean a single distinguishable person. It began to be used in its modern sense starting from the 18th century, but it didn't gain currency until the 19th century. And as for today, the perspective of the individual in one form or another is increasingly celebrated, as John Mayer observes. This is especially evident in our social media culture, in which cultivating identity plays a major role. As a result of the hypothetical as-ifness that we have developed from these observations, we achieve self-authorization, meaning that we have immediate control over our own behavior and rather than ascribing our thoughts to external gods or ancestors. This, in turn, leads to self-autonomy and thus control over ourself and our identity. With this development, we are able to tell stories and dismiss a narrative as unreal, thus switching into a play frame. The richness of one's language not only leads to greater self-awareness and agency, it also plays a key role in developing a mature theory of mind. In a study conducted in 2003, researchers found evidence that language promotes false belief understanding, such as assessing what others think and believe. Through an emerging sign language in Nicaragua, they examined false belief understanding in deaf learners. In this deaf community, language acquisition is delayed until adulthood. Participants were divided into two groups that were exposed to the sign language before and after 1984. Half of the first group produced no mental state words at all. Adults with incomplete language and no congenital deficits failed to fully understand the beliefs of others. These findings thus indicate that consciousness comes with the development of language. Insight into our consciousness through deconstructing reality. To conclude from the findings above, new technological inventions to tell stories, such as cinema or television, have the potential to expand our language and thus change how we interact with others and the world. In creating new realities, we need to make use of not only physics but also concepts from our real world that are derived from language. In this way, we are able to deconstruct reality and make something else out of it. Fictional characters, for example, are always created within our minds, as they are the result of intricate physical and psychological processes. Certain lines on a piece of paper construct a face or a person for us. We assign certain fictional propositions to the character and thus play a game of make-believe, agreeing with other imaginers that the fictional character is really to be seen in a comic book or on the big screen in a movie theater. However, we can gain insight into our consciousness by working out the differences between fictional characters and us. They are reflections of ourselves that work like mirrors to help us understand how we perceive ourselves and to understand the problem of consciousness. For example, how can someone believe that a fictional character is actually real? Why is it that we cannot turn our responses to fiction off? Tamar Chabot-Gendler offers an answer to this question with her concept of A-leaf. When we A-leaf, then we are put into a mental state that consists of associatively linked content, which is a cluster of contents that tend to be co-activated, according to Gendler. Therefore, one may or currently A-leaf something with or without being aware of being put into such a state. This means that a content from a mind space or internal environment, e.g. when dreaming, is triggered in certain situations by our ambient environment, e.g. when watching a movie. A more specific example could be the fear of Tyrannosaurus rex. A fear that is irrational because it's an animal from prehistoric times that is already extinct and therefore does not exist in our world today. Therefore, we can make progress through introspection through these fictional stories. Reality is thus not necessarily an objective truth, but rather a subjective construct of our mind that is shaped by our experiences. In this sense, to be conscious does therefore not mean to be awake, to perceive, to think, or to reason. Rather, it means assigning terms to objects and concepts around us, filling our mind space with metaphors to gain self-awareness and to become aware of how we perceive reality. Immersing oneself in fictional worlds is, therefore, something we have in common with lucid dreamers. The Tibetan teacher Tatang Tulku explains that with continuing practice of lucid dreaming, we see less and less difference between the waking and the dream state. Our experiences in waking life become more vivid and varied, the result of a lighter and more refined awareness. Just like in our dream state, our consciousness consistently draws upon the content stored in it, including terms for certain objects, metaphors, experiences, or perspectives of ourselves. This content is triggered by certain associations, and metaphors can help us solving problems by taking them out of the playframe and setting them in relation to our everyday life. From the spiritual to the psychological. A transformation from a cat into a woman, like the one in Harry Potter that we have examined earlier, can only be seen as a metaphor today. As Brian J. McVeigh writes, angels, demons, and gods migrated from the spiritual realm into the psychological realm, becoming ids, egos, superegos, executive egos, self, personality, cognitive processes, etc. In ancient times, these metaphors were taken literally, as the distinction between the literal and the figurative was not well understood. In other words, there was no switching between the play and the reality frame. The ancient Egyptians, for example, believed that the cosmos needed to be revived daily, so they performed rituals that were supposed to make the sun rise each day. Today we can understand the rising of the sun as a metaphor for a new beginning, providing an orientational framework for a civilization. The British cultural anthropologist Victor Turner explains that in order to live, to breathe, and to generate novelty, human beings have had to create, by structural means, spaces and times in the calendar or in the cultural cycles of their most cherished groups, in which cannot be captured in the classificatory nets of their quotidian, routinized spheres of action. For him, we human beings, quote, impose upon ourselves innumerable constraints and boundaries to keep chaos at bay, but often at the cost of failing to make discoveries and inventions. With the ability to express themselves creatively, ancient Greek people were able to, quote, express their individual feelings, thoughts, and desires in tragedy, as Bruno Snell makes aware. Erich Neumann observed that the adventures of Odysseus in the ancient Greek story of the Odyssey revolved around resisting temptations to willpower and heroism. Examples are the siren song, the love of the nymph Calypso, the seductive spell of Circe turning men into pigs. They represent the desire for not being conscious. In this context, Odysseus emerges as a hero for resisting these temptations. He loses interest in the dark forces of the non-conscious. His victory over it symbolizes the binding of the Cyclops, whose eyes represent the third eye of knowledge. The birth of the hero represents the birth of the ego. As a result, the world becomes ambivalent. This leads to the universal drama that all cultures need to struggle with. The emergence of the ego gives rise to different interpretations and, consequently, different playframes that hold distinct meanings and values. Insisting on only one playframe often results in conflict because we fail to recognize other perspectives. And switching between frames can be learned through our ability to create other realities using advanced technological developments like computers. Advanced awareness through self-reflexivity. With discovering the concept of imagination and our insight into how we perceive reality through advanced technical developments to create different perspectives, in example, camera and computer graphics, we can create entire universes out of the language we have acquired. We can make new discoveries through metaphors and create new playframes while simultaneously dismissing these fictional worlds as unreal by switching into the playframe. This process represents a metaframing where we take our analysis to another level of abstraction. We are, therefore, becoming aware of ourselves becoming aware, meaning that we switch our perspective not only between ourselves as an actor and an observer of ourselves, but also as a position in which a third person or group observes ourselves. Through this self-reflexivity, we are able to recognize multiple playframes that hold different meanings and values. Erich Neumann observes, not only power, money and lust, but religion, art and politics as exclusive determinants in the form of parties, nations, sects, movements and isms of every description take possession of the masses and destroy the individual. This universal perspective gives the individual more autonomy, as we are able to conclude that everything is serious play and we are thus not trapped in a single playframe. In this sense, the world becomes a playground in which we can experiment with different perspectives and meanings, compare them, and make well-founded decisions based on our findings. This switching between frames is particularly vital when it comes to reading novels, watching movies, or playing video games to differentiate between fiction and reality. Moreover, these activities can in turn help us to expand our language and make us aware that reality is constructed with terms that can have a universal meaning in both our worlds, fiction and reality. Conclusion: consciousness is learned. As this essay has shown, there is a substantial evidence that consciousness is learned, a proposition that I share with Julian Jaynes and author Brian J. McVeigh, who writes that consciousness is an acquired cultural capability grounded in metaphorical language. It has evolved over recent centuries through developing different perspectives of the self, as well as concepts like metaphors and metalinguistic frames. Consequently, someone from an ancient culture several thousand years ago does not have the same consciousness as we humans do today. This cultural development gave us human beings more agency and thus freedom, as we learned to be aware of how we perceive reality through it. While in ancient times, humans were bound to irrational behaviors and perceptions based on the belief that a mystical world would have an effect on them and nature, we gain more freedom by developing concepts such as fiction and irrationality, freeing ourselves from the mental shackles that held us captive, an endeavor that, according to Erich Fromm, is part of modern European and American history, especially because the idea of individualism plays a major role in Western philosophy. Consequently, it is not technical developments to experience stories and art in new ways that have set us free, but the insight into how we perceive reality and ourselves through them. Consciousness and the dangers of AI. Concluding from our findings, we shouldn't underestimate the importance of introspection and therefore foster the ability and the will to reflect on our thoughts and experiences, especially in times where technology, such as artificial intelligence, handles more and more of our tasks by solving problems for us. In this sense, we should perceive AI as what it is, an advanced language model. It is a technology, a tool, and an extension of ourselves, as it isn't self-aware. It can't feel emotions and thus reflect on any lived experiences, as well as replace our unconscious interiority. The development of ego consciousness and thus the self toward individualism allows us to improve the quality of our constructed objective reality with becoming aware of playframes that hold different meanings and values. As the history of consciousness in this essay has shown, the psyche, and thus our conscious interiority, proves to be malleable. Erich Neumann describes the psyche as the place of creation. This is twofold, as the psyche can change through constructs that we have created. The world of science is such a creative construct of our curiosity and reasoning with the potential to give us insight into our consciousness, as we have seen above. Thus, the development of consciousness can be understood as a feedback mechanism, and from this we can learn that taking responsibility for new technological developments is of crucial importance. When AI takes over mental tasks, our consciousness becomes rigid, as Neumann says, as it gets trapped in fabricated structures. Moreover, it becomes particularly dangerous for our individual autonomy when AI plays a large role in our social-political matrix with taking over the tasks of our metaphor me. This may lead to the fact that we become unaware of what we are currently doing when we trust technology to, quote, solve our problems with AI, quote end. As Brian J. McBaich explains, the commands and orders we give to ourselves are ultimately socially rooted. The I-me relationship is social in origin and social in operation, as between two people, the I controls, commands, communicates with the me. When AI takes over our daily mental tasks, then there is the risk that we do not make any experiences with what we are doing. This also carries the risk of becoming dependent on another entity that operates our me. For example, conscious interiority is not required for riding a bicycle to a certain destination, as we do not need to be aware of this activity to reach our destination. Thinking does therefore not require consciousness, unless it involves thinking being aware of it, as it is an automatic process following instruction from material constructions for instructions to one's mind and the materials on which the instruction is to operate, as Julian Jaynes and Brian J. McBaich put it. However, we can observe ourselves riding a bicycle from another perspective from the outside, which requires being aware of this activity and thus an inner mind space, meaning consciousness. Furthermore, we need to actively do something in order to reflect on our experiences for the analog I and thus a different perspective of ourselves. In this case, we make a distinction between subject, analog I, and object, metaphor me. A discipline that first emerged in Plato's intellectual movement around 400 BC. It sought to analyze and classify results of observations instead of merely experiencing them or imitating them. In this respect, the subject, our mind, examines the object, our actions. This ability to differentiate between subject and object is absent in children. Jean Piaget writes, "The child is a realist, and a realist because he has not yet grasped the distinction between subject and object and the internal nature of thought." Hence, if we do not see the development of AI usage critical, we risk developing a realist, egocentric, and obedient worldview in which we take things for granted that the AI has done for us, being trapped in the consciousness of 5 to 8-year-old children. Similar to the mentality of the ancient Greek, whose, quote, action or perception is determined by the divine forces operative in the world, quote, and there's a risk that our actions could be determined by AI, which could be grasped as a personal act. When we are observing our actions that we ourselves are actively doing, we can become aware of others observing us, which makes a certain idea of ourselves, and thus an identity, possible. In this respect, it will be difficult to have control over ourselves with reflecting on our behavior when our metaphor me is controlled by AI and only receives orders from us, and the freedom of the individual is therefore at risk. In order to preserve this freedom of the individual, which we have achieved through our cultural development that lasted several thousand years, we humans have to continue to reflect on our lived experiences. Instead of replacing our psyche, AI can contribute to the feedback mechanism that makes our consciousness grow with the creation of virtual realities and perspectives of ourselves through which we can reflect on ourselves and our perception of reality. That's it for this video. I hope you enjoyed my essay, found it interesting, and if you have any questions or feedback, feel free to post it in the comment section below. If you really did enjoy my essay, then I'm happy to announce that I'm currently reworking my essay to a full-length book. If you'd like to receive any updates, follow me on Instagram, follow me on YouTube, and stay up to date on the progress. Did you submit an essay to the Berggruen Prize Essay Competition on Consciousness? If yes, post it down below. I would be happy to read it. That's it for this video. I'll be back with a new video next year. So, bye!